Drakon, Book 4 of the Draka Trilogy. Yeah, while the other Draka books are usually thought of as alternate history, Drakon breaks from that with a story about a genetically engineered superhuman crossing through a portal from an alternate universe into a world very much like ours and causing all manner of mayhem. It has a very different feel compared to the rest of the series and mostly avoids one of the common points of argument over the Draka books. The Draka books aren't actually alternate history. That genre's stories are at their core about whatever the divergence is. What if the South won the Civil War, or what if the Germans won World War II? The story follows directly from that premise and points back at it throughout. The first Draka book, Marching Through Georgia, doesn't do that. It gives us some background, but it's just world building rather than exploring a counterfactual. It's not a story about what if the British took over the Cape Colony in the late 18th century, but rather a dystopian story of what if America had an evil twin. It's not supposed to be a wholly believable history any more than 1984 or Brave New World are. Drakon jettisons most of that and even riffs on it a little. Let's begin with our villain, Gwendolyn Ingolfsson. By the time of Drakon, it's been 400 years since the Draka destroyed their enemies and settled into their final society. She's lived through all of that and is high in the running for the most experienced and skilled killer in human history. The Draka have gone so far as engineering intelligent prey animals to hunt, centaurs for example, because they've turned themselves into optimized warriors and they have no one left to fight. Their only real enemy, the descendants of the Americans and allies that fled to Alpha Centauri at the end of the final war, are so far away that close-in combat isn't possible. But there's a race to develop faster-than-light propulsion, which would allow scores to be settled. A Draka experiment goes awry, and Gwen is dumped into late 90s New York, where she immediately slaughters a bunch of thugs, leading to Detective Carmaggio getting pulled into the weirdness. Once she gets her bearings, Gwen devises a plan to establish a beacon to signal her people who will invade this Earth, and failing that, she'll take over herself. But first she'll need resources, money, and loyal serfs. And Gwen isn't entirely human. They did a full comparative DNA run. I quote, non-human, about 94% correspondence. That's less like us than a chimp, a mammal, a primate, but not human, strictly speaking. Homo drakensis is an engineered species that's not only physically stronger and higher IQ than the base model HSAP, but also has some more subtle mechanisms for controlling the slaves. Conscious control of pheromones, for example. Setting just the right balance of fear, attraction, and dominance can go a long way toward getting people to do what she wants. But not all the way. She needs a few people that know what she is to handle details while she builds a tech company to raise capital and build the equipment she needs to contact her people. The first of these permanent members of her household is Dolores, a flight attendant she meets on the way to Colombia. There's Alice, a young Australian woman with a somewhat shady past that gets brought on and eventually used as an incubator. But perhaps her most useful lieutenant is a lawyer, Tom Kerstens. Her pitch to him centers on his outspoken environmentalism, or rather, the activist that he had been in his youth. He's become jaded, doesn't see any solutions. Technofixes won't solve our problems. It's in the nature of humanity to foul its nest. We'd have to change human nature. That's why I gave up. I'm glad you said that, Gwen said, her smile growing broader. You agree, then, that humans aren't fit to be in charge here. Gwen proceeds to show him scenes of her world, full of lush jungles and forest where there had once been sprawling cities. Factories and mechanized farming are replaced by scenes of healthy peasants working fields with hand tools. It's all so bloody pastoral. Imagine a world, she said softly, almost whispering, forcing him to lean closer to hear, where the population of Earth is 500 million and stable, not 7 billion and rising. Where not an ounce of fossil fuel is burned. No mines, no factories, no fission reactors or coal-burning plants, no tankers full of oil. The sea and the skies and the land swarm with life, and whole continents are nature preserves. Some of you will recognize that 500 million population limit is the first item listed on the Georgia Guidestones. Kirsten here is a parody of the wealthy Malthusian environmentalist. Show him pretty nature pictures and he's on board. Throw in a massive population reduction and all the better. Now, obviously not all environmentalists are anti-human tools. In fact, very few are. You think you can bring your people here and they'll save the Earth. Among other things, I warn you, the consequences will be fairly drastic. His face hardened. As drastic as losing the ozone layer? Global warming? He shook his head decisively. No, it doesn't matter how drastic. He goes on to handle a lot of the day-to-day running of Gwen's company. He's a rather blunt example of someone who allows their ideology and principle based on doing something good to be used as a lure to make them serve monsters. Through this appeal to his cherished beliefs, along with a hefty dose of Draka pheromones and psychological manipulation, he becomes convinced that the ends justify the means. But so often, the means are the end. And the seed money for her operation is pirate treasure, which I thought was a nice touch for a traveler from another timeline. I knew what and where, she said. Then I checked to see if anyone had found it. Nobody had, therefore it had to be here. But lest you get the impression that she's some overpowered girl boss playing Bond villain, she also leaves a trail of bodies, and she's really rapey. Like, really. This book would not fly if it had a male Draka as the antagonist. But if you just read Drakon, you miss something crucial to this character. We first meet Gwen as a child in the third book, The Stone Dogs. She looks a bit off, she's a new species after all, but she's a little girl. She likes to play, she gets scared and clings to her nana, having no idea how messed up it is that she was incubated in a slave that now takes care of her. It adds this humanizing element to the villain because we know she wasn't always the monster we see in Drakon. She becomes that through a series of external influences and her own decisions. It's like when someone commits a horribly violent crime and some close friend or relative says, "No, he wouldn't do that, I've known him since we were kids," or something to that effect. That's Gwen. We've known her since she was a kid. It doesn't absolve her of anything. She chooses to be a monster at every turn. But it's a better book in context of the previous one. Fortunately for that Earth, she isn't the only visitor from a parallel timeline. At the end of the final war, a group of Americans and their allies fled the solar system on a generational starship called the New America. They now live on a planet they've named Samothrace in the Alpha Centauri system, and they send an agent across to stop Gwen's nefarious plot. That agent is Kenneth Lafarge, descendant of the Lafarges from the earlier books in the series. Ken and Gwen, really? There's even a family connection, as much as it's possible to be related to a genetically engineered murder monkey. All the genetically superior superhuman stuff is doubly interesting here when you consider that in the previous book, the American-led Alliance for Democracy was very much an exaggerated version of the Cold War America that had embraced a lot of Nazi Germany's military and scientific establishment. Ken Lafarge, the only one who can stop the Draka in this story, is a personification of wholesome Americana and Aryan Herrenvolk fused together. Close-cut blonde hair, blue eyes, a farm boy face, snub-nosed and tanned, square chin, jock's build, broad shoulders and narrow waist, dressed in a suit and carrying an attaché case, sort of like a Norman Rockwell painting of an up-and-coming small-town lawyer. The two characters are personifications of the two major powers in the Stone Dogs, and while the earlier books present a conflict of ideologies and cultural assumptions, by this point speciation has made it a fundamentally different fight. We Drakensis don't need ideology much. We've got genetics instead. Our social order is hard-coded into our nervous systems. Drakon gives us a glimpse of the world these new Draka have created. Not only have they turned themselves into Homo Drakensis, but the bulk of the population has been subtly altered into Homo Servus. Highly intelligent but docile people, highly sensitive to pheromonal influence. They're what makes Draka society possible. In the book, we only get a brief snippet through the eyes of a Servus, a scientist named Tullia. Her perspective on the conflict is telling. War flared beyond the orbit of Pluto. The ferals attacked, the claw of a universe cold and cruel, with only the masters standing between her folk and oblivion. The Draka system has transcended slavery or castes. It's become almost a hive. The Servus are completely enthralled to their masters. They're biologically tailored to them and are probably incapable of being free. While Tullia has completely embraced her servitude to a degree I, as an irascible American, find almost inconceivable, she is right about one thing. If the Draka ever did lose the war and the humans living on Samothrace returned, it would be the end of the service. Would you want to integrate an engineered slave race into your gene pool? But it's not so clear-cut, because Gwen's collection of serfs exhibits similar sentiments. Dolores, for example, says this: "That damn Samothracian, how I wish you'd killed him." Even after Gwen herself is dead, some of her household remain absolutely devoted servants, transferring their loyalty to her infant Drakensis child, which they will protect and raise, knowing full well it will take ownership of them. The temptation to dismiss the service as less than human, they don't feel things like we do, kinda falls apart here when plenty of non-altered, freeborn humans succumb to the same control mechanisms. And I think there's an interesting bit of commentary here. Gwen, like Draka society in general, is essentially parasitic. She's a personification of imperialism, manipulating and using others as instruments for her own ends. She needs them, and while she may take care of them materially, they are entirely expendable. This also gets to one of the ways that Drakon falls a bit short for me. So Gwen builds her beacon, makes contact with her own timeline, and the Draka are preparing an invasion force because why not commit forces to conquer a territory you only just learned exists and can only reach with energy-intensive, unreliable technology that you don't really understand? It's part of who the Draka are. They can't help themselves. When we've beaten the humans back, it opens the universe to us. We anticipated thousands of millennia to bring the galaxy under the domination of the race. This will reduce the timescale by orders of magnitude. But Gwen's backup plan was to take control of Earth herself, working through intermediaries, consolidating more and more until she can openly rule and start drastic changes. I think that's the more interesting story. It's one that's teased at the very end, with Kirsten's and Alice, the brooder for Gwen's clone child, escaping in a submarine to cause problems another day. A story about a young Drakensis burrowing deep into human society, slowly accumulating power in the shadows like some demonic entity. An enemy that very few can identify, but who leaves evidence that only the most obtuse can miss over time. This possibility is left hanging as a possible future. And while I'm not really a fan of the Draka omnibus, The Domination, and highly recommend new readers go to the original volumes, the collected works inserts of brief scenes with Carmaggio, set in 2014 after 15 years of exploiting Draka technology, do take on more weight when you think that somewhere on Earth a little Drakensis is growing up. The first 3 Draka books show us an alternate world, one that reflects and amplifies the worst of us, both in the cruelty and opportunism of the Draka, and the short-sightedness and cowardly rationalizing of the Alliance. Drakon personifies it. It gives the Draka a single face, and most of the characters find it rather attractive. It balances that with glimpses of the world they've built, clean, green, and beautiful, but at a horrendous cost in lives and suffering. And most of its people are slaves and happy for it. It's not my favorite Draka book, but it plays off the others. It mostly sets aside the dystopian vision aspect, but it also frees itself from the "actually that could never happen because X" that always follows in the wake of alternate history. If you only read one Draka book, don't pick Drakon. But as a part 4 of 3, it adds some new layers with its vision of what the Draka do with the world and to themselves. A final note. It's mentioned more than once that the Drakensis, while having higher baseline intelligence, are less imaginative than unaltered humans. Your species is more scientifically creative than mine. We modified ourselves neurologically before we fully understood the brain-mind interface, she said. For that matter, we don't fully understand it yet. Drakensis seem to have less capacity for intuitive leaps than you do, although we've got more G-factor intelligence. Perhaps we oversimplified while trying to eliminate some redundancies. It's a fascinating detail and a nice critique of the technocrats that in their zeal to improve themselves, the Draka inadvertently tossed out something vitally human that they can never get back. They've split humanity in half, with themselves taking on all the violent, domineering traits and leaving the meek and gentle service to do the real creative work. They've turned themselves into Skeksis, charging full speed into a dead end. Or a more obscure reference, the Neo-Sapiens from the old Exo Squad cartoon, engineered to be physically superior to humans, but they end up kind of hardwired to be linear and inflexible in their thinking. This idea that by taking control of our own evolution in a deliberate, guided way, we end up losing something essential is interesting to me. Maybe it's deep distrust of central planning, or maybe it's something deeper about the necessity of a little chaos for a healthy mind. Whatever the case, I'm not going to watch all of Exo Squad. That's about as likely as getting more Draka books. So for Gwen's portrait, I started with a photo reference of my wife in this case. With the warp tool in Photoshop, I heightened the cheekbones, gave the chin a point, a lot of distortions, taking cues from the cover art, and then sent that to the tablet to paint all over it to get the expression right and make it a rough version of the portrait I had in my head. Then off to Stable Diffusion with it. Control now to run a few renders at varying settings to get a smoother, more refined version of what I did. Blend the best of 3 or 4 in Photoshop, and here we are.